Hi everyone, this is Lara Hammock from the Marble Draw channel, and today I'm going to discuss giving an allowance to kids. I'm doing this in 3 parts. This one will walk through the basics and answer some general questions. The second will tackle how to make it happen with a minimum of fuss. I now use iAllowance. And the third will discuss some tips for giving allowance to teenagers. Growing up, my parents were frugal in the extreme. We did our own repairs, didn't buy any new clothes until I was well into high school, cut our own hair, grew our own food, etc. You get the picture. If you guess that they were also not great about giving a reasonable allowance, then you would be correct. They gave me 25 cents a month. And even in those days, there was not much you can buy for 25 cents. I was determined to do a little better with my kids. Not so that they could have more stuff, although that would most certainly be an adverse side effect, but because I view money management as one of the core skills to becoming a self-sustaining adult. So really, I think of allowance as an education tool as opposed to a reward for good behavior. This allowance philosophy informs some of my latter decision making and definitely differs from the views of some. I have teenagers now, but I started down this path when my kids were very young. My son started receiving an allowance when he was 5.5, and my daughter right when she turned 5. Just as an aside that I'll probably repeat, you don't have to start when they're young. Start now. Start anytime. So I began by reading a bajillion books about allowance, mostly Christian parenting books, interestingly. They seem to be the crowd who was most interested in this topic. And I came up with my plan based on a synthesis of their wisdom and my goals. So first question, how much to give? I got this figure from a number of books, most of which advocated doing a weekly allowance. A reasonable amount seemed to be half of their age per week, or twice their age per month. For my 15-year-old son, for example, that works out to $7.50 a week or $30 a month. They always get raises on their birthdays. Next question, should their allowance include long-term saving? So considering this was an educational tool, I wanted to make sure I was actively teaching some core money concepts, like don't spend it all at one time, save every month for bigger purchases, and set aside some money to give to charity. I wish I could give some source credit here, but this was easily 10 years ago, so I haven't been able to find the original source, but it seems to be fairly common allowance practice now. Rather than giving all of the money in one hunk, you divide it into 3 deposits. Roughly 60% of it goes into spend, which is just what it sounds like. This is to be spent anytime on anything. 30% of it goes into save. So this gets saved up and can be used on purchases that are over $30. The idea is that kids this young can't really grasp the abstraction of investing or saving for college, but they can see that saving every month will allow them to purchase something of greater value later on. And then you set aside about 10% for charity. So once a year, you'll write a check to a charity that's picked out by your child. I think they actually call this share now. The word charity is out of vogue. So none of these percentages are absolute, and I wasn't going to be bothered with coins, so I divided these into full dollar amounts. More on the logistics of this in part 2. Next question, should allowance be linked to chores? There's quite a bit of controversy on this topic. People tend to feel very strongly one way or another. My kids are required to do chores, but they are not in any way linked to their allowance. There's a couple reasons for this. Number one, again, allowance is part of their education in my mind. It's not a reward. So I want them to learn how to manage money, whether they do their chores or not. And number two, they have to do their chores because they live in our house. It's not negotiable. In other words, they can't decide that they don't want their allowance this week, so they're not going to do their chores. So I don't have an issue if others decide differently. It's just not the way that I have my system set up. Next question, what do they use their allowance for? So our rule is, I buy needs, allowance is for wants. I love that even with teeny tiny kids, there are lots of conversations around what is a need and what is a want. Do you need new sneakers? So that sounds like a need, so we will buy them. But we will not spring for the newest, most expensive shoe that everyone is wearing. We set a baseline price, and if my son wants to buy the expensive shoes, well, he can pay for the difference out of his allowance. My favorite part of this is that there are 0 fights in stores. Most of the tchotchkes that they want are obviously not needs, so they can decide whether they want to spend their allowance on them or not. End of conversation. Just a quick warning, you will end up with a billion worthless tchotchkes in your house, which might drive you crazy, but it's unfortunately part of the process. Okay, next question. Can I use allowance to promote good behavior? Absolutely. Economic incentives and disincentives are prime tools for behavior manipulation. When they were little, I disincentivized candy and sweets by making them 2 times the actual value. In other words, if they wanted a lollipop that cost $1, they actually had to pay me $2 for it. I called that the candy tax. And I still incentivize reading by paying for half of books. I call that the book subsidy. I still prefer that they get books out of the library, but I think reading is important, thus the incentive. In addition, I pay for things that I think are good for them, even if they aren't strictly a need. For example, for my ADHD son, I paid for half of his trampoline because I thought it would be a good way to expel some of his boundless energy, and I was right. I'm perfectly happy to accept their arguments on behalf of other good-for-you purchases, but I may not always rule in their favor. Next question. This is kind of philosophical. Does giving an allowance promote materialism? So there were definitely times that I thought my kids had way too much. When my daughter was around 7, she could afford to buy a new Barbie approximately every month. We had mountains of Barbies coming out of our ears. I wrung my hands and I fretted that having allowance was spoiling the kids and making them super entitled. I had so little in the way of material goods when I was growing up. Was I creating materialistic monsters? Over time, I've come to accept that this money education does not necessarily train gratitude, but it does train responsibility, and sometimes those concepts can be weirdly similar. Or rather, responsibility can beget respect and gratitude. And in the end, I decided that responsibility and money management competence were a worthy goal in and of themselves. Okay, so those are the basics of our allowance system. Join me in part 2 when I talk about how to make it happen with a minimum of fuss. Leave your questions and experience in the comment section, and thanks for watching.